To the naked eye, the coastline of southern Chile appears permanent. The cold, gray waters of the southern Pacific wash against dark volcanic sand, rising sharply to meet the temperate rainforests and the foothills of the Andes Mountains. It is a landscape defined by verticality, where the earth reaches up toward the sky, seemingly anchored by its own massive weight. But beneath this serenity lies a geological conflict of immense, invisible scale. This is a subduction zone. For millions of years, the dense Nazca tectonic plate has been driving itself eastward, diving beneath the lighter South American continent. It moves at a rate of roughly 3 inches per year, a pace imperceptible to the human eye, roughly the speed at which fingernails grow. Usually, this motion is gradual. The plates slide past one another in a slow, grinding descent into the Earth's mantle. But in certain eras, and at specific depths, the plates lock. Friction binds the jagged edges of the crust together. The motion stops, but the driving force does not. The pressure continues to build, accumulating potential energy like a drawn bowstring, waiting for the physical limit of the rock to be reached. On the afternoon of May 22, 1960, that limit had been reached. In the city of Valdivia, situated at the confluence of 3 rivers, the atmosphere was heavy with the quiet of a late autumn Sunday. Families had finished their midday meals. The markets were closed. The streets were largely empty, save for the occasional pedestrian navigating the damp, cool air. To the residents of the Los Rios region, the ground beneath their feet felt solid, immutable, and safe. There was no sound to indicate that 20 miles beneath the ocean floor, a rupture was beginning that would tear the crust of the planet open for nearly 600 miles. The bowstring was about to snap. To understand the scale of what was lost, one must first understand what existed. In 1960, Valdivia was not a remote outpost. It was a thriving industrial hub, a city of nearly 20,000 residents characterized by a unique architectural and cultural identity. Heavily influenced by German immigration in the mid-19th century, the city possessed a distinct European character. Tanneries, breweries, and shipyards lined the riverbanks. Sturdy wooden homes, built to withstand the heavy rainfall of the region, sat upon foundations that had held firm for decades. It was a city of commerce and stability, the capital of its province, connected to the rest of Chile by rail, road, and telegraph. However, the stability of Valdivia was an illusion maintained only by the temporary silence of the fault line. The region was already in a state of alert. Just 33 hours prior, on the morning of May 21, a powerful earthquake had struck the city of Concepcion, some 200 miles to the north. That event, measuring 8.1 on the magnitude scale, had been catastrophic in its own right. Buildings had crumbled, lives had been lost. The shock waves had rattled windows as far south as Valdivia, serving as a grim reminder of the region's seismic volatility. Crucially, the Concepcion earthquake had severed the primary communication lines running south. The telephone and telegraph cables that linked Valdivia to Santiago and the northern government centers were dead. This isolation was the first unseen fracture in the survival system. On Sunday, May 22, the people of Valdivia were living in a localized information vacuum. They knew a disaster had occurred to the north, but they did not know the specific geological mechanics at play. There were no seismologists on the radio explaining that the stress transfer from the Concepcion rupture was now loading the southern segment of the fault with unbearable pressure. Instead, a dangerous psychological phenomenon took hold, the belief that the worst was over. It is a common human response to disaster. Having experienced the peripheral shaking of the May 21 event, many Valdivians believed the energy of the earth had been expended. Sunday morning was spent in a state of relieved tension. People attended Mass. Families walked along the Costanera, the riverside promenade. There was talk of organizing aid for the victims in the north. The weather was damp and cold, typical for May in the southern hemisphere. Rain had been falling intermittently, swelling the Calle, Valdivia, and Cauca rivers that surrounded the city. The ground was saturated. The water table was high. In the countryside surrounding the city, the agricultural rhythm continued uninterrupted. Farmers tended to livestock, workers in the timber mills prepared for the coming week. The geography here was softer, rolling hills, wetlands, and river deltas. But this soft, sediment-rich soil, which made the region so fertile for agriculture, possessed a fatal flaw in the context of seismology. When solid rock shakes, it vibrates. When water-saturated soil shakes, it liquefies. The foundations of the bridges, the roads, and the heavy concrete buildings of downtown Valdivia were resting on ground that was chemically prepared to turn into a fluid. At 2:55 p.m., the President of Chile was broadcasting a message to the nation, addressing the tragedy in Concepcion. In Valdivia, the radio crackled with the news. The city remained cut off, blind to the tectonic reality, waiting for the rain to stop. They had 16 minutes left. At exactly 3:11 p.m., the temporary peace ended. It did not begin with a crash, but with a sway. The initial motion was gentle, a rolling undulation caused by the arrival of the primary seismic waves. In the cafes and living rooms of Valdivia, people looked up. Cups rattled in saucers. There was a brief moment of recognition, a collective pause as the population assessed the threat. In Chile, a country accustomed to tremors, this initial movement usually signals a minor event that will pass in seconds. But the rolling did not stop. It intensified. Seconds later, the secondary waves arrived. The ground shifted from a roll to a violent, jarring snap. The earth did not just shake, it convulsed. The rupture velocity was supersonic. The fault line unzipped from north to south at a speed of nearly 2 miles per second. As the rock shattered deep underground, it released energy on a scale that defies standard comprehension. The magnitude was 9.5. To provide context, this event released approximately 20,000 times more energy than the nuclear bomb dropped on Hiroshima. It was not merely an earthquake, it was a planetary realignment. In downtown Valdivia, gravity seemed to lose its authority. The shaking was so violent that standing became impossible. People who attempted to run were thrown to the ground as if the pavement were the deck of a ship in a hurricane. Witnesses reported seeing the solid asphalt of the streets rippling in visible waves, lifting and falling like water. The noise was deafening. It was not the sound of crumbling masonry, but a deep, subterranean roar, the sound of the continental crust grinding against itself. This acoustic pressure rose from the earth, drowning out human screams. But the true horror of the 1960 event was not the intensity. It was the duration. A typical destructive earthquake lasts for 30 to 45 seconds. A minute is considered an eternity. The shaking in Valdivia continued for 10 full minutes. For 600 seconds, the world disintegrated. Timber frames sheared off their foundations. Concrete walls pulverized into dust. Giant poplars and eucalyptus trees whipped back and forth, their tips touching the ground on either side before snapping. The clock towers froze, then fell. Inside the minds of the survivors, the concept of time distorted. The rational belief that, this will stop, was replaced by a primal terror that the earth itself was dying. There was no pause, no breath, no respite. For 10 minutes, the laws of physics were suspended, and thousands of people lay prone in the mud and debris, waiting for the ground to stop moving or for the earth to swallow them whole. Then, as slowly as it had begun, the violent motion subsided into a low vibration. The roaring faded. Silence returned to Valdivia, but the city that had existed at 3:10 p.m. was gone. As the dust settled over the ruined streets of Valdivia, a terrifying anomaly was observed at the riverbanks. The Calle River, usually a wide, flowing artery carrying water from the Andes to the Pacific, was receding. The water level was dropping rapidly, revealing muddy banks that had not seen sunlight for centuries. To a hydrologist, this was a signal far more dangerous than the earthquake itself. The water was not disappearing, it was being held back. 50 miles upstream, the geography of the Andes had collapsed. The drainage system of this region is complex, a chain of 7 lakes that filter water down through the mountains. The final reservoir in this chain is Lake Rhynehu, which drains into the San Pedro River. When the earthquake struck, it triggered massive landslides along the steep, unstable slopes surrounding the river's source. Millions of tons of clay, soil, and uprooted forest slid simultaneously into the riverbed. Within minutes, 3 distinct natural dams, known locally as tacos, had formed, completely blocking the outflow of Lake Rhynehu. The largest of these dams stood nearly 80 feet tall and over half a mile wide. The flow of the San Pedro stopped instantly. Behind the wall of mud and debris, the water level of Lake Rhynehu began to rise. The mathematics of the situation were catastrophic. The lake was filling at a rate that would cause it to overflow the natural dams within weeks, perhaps days depending on the rainfall. When that happened, the water would not simply spill over, it would breach the soft soil of the dams catastrophically. An estimated 4.8 billion cubic meters of water would be unleashed in a single pulse. This wave, traveling down the river valley, would obliterate every settlement in its path and strike the wreckage of Valdivia with the force of a tsunami from the mountains. The survivors, already sleeping in the ruins of their homes, were now facing total erasure. The response to this threat became known as the Renahuazo. It remains one of the greatest feats of emergency engineering in history. The Chilean government, led by engineer Raúl Sáenz, mobilized immediately. The objective was simple but nearly impossible: dig a bypass channel through the blockage to lower the lake level in a controlled manner before it could burst. However, the infrastructure to support such an operation no longer existed. Roads were severed. Bridges were down. Heavy machinery could not be transported to the remote site quickly enough. The only available resource was human labor. Hundreds of workers, joined by soldiers and local farmers, converged on the blockade. They worked in conditions that defy modern safety standards. The rain continued to fall, turning the blockage into an unstable slurry of mud. Aftershocks continued to rock the ground beneath their feet, threatening to trigger fresh landslides that would bury the workforce alive. They worked with shovels. For weeks, these men, later immortalized as the Paleros, or shovel heroes, dug by hand. They moved thousands of cubic meters of wet, heavy earth, forming a human conveyor belt of mud. It was a race against a rising clock. Every hour, the lake crept higher up the measuring stakes. The camp established at the site was a scene of grim determination. There was little food, no dry clothing, and no guarantee of success. The engineers calculated flow rates and soil density on rain-soaked paper, trying to predict the breaking point of the dam. It was not a battle of technology against nature, but of endurance. The survival of 100,000 people downstream depended not on a miracle, but on the friction of steel shovels against wet clay, hour after hour, day after day, in the freezing rain. While the shovel heroes fought the river and the mountains, the citizens of Valdivia fought a different war in the mud. The city had ceased to function as an urban entity. The concept of home had vanished in the span of 10 minutes, replaced by a landscape of splintered timber and twisted rebar. But the most immediate threat to human life was not the debris, it was the exposure. Southern Chile in late May is the gateway to winter. The temperatures dropped near freezing at night, and the rain was relentless. In the days following the cataclysm, a new architectural form emerged from the wreckage: the rucco. A rucco was not a house, nor was it a tent. It was a desperate collage of survival. Survivors scavenged the ruins for anything that could repel water. Sheets of corrugated zinc, ripped from the roofs of destroyed factories, became walls. Fractured doors became floorboards to keep feet out of the rising mud. Plastic sheeting, salvaged lumber, and even furniture were lashed together to create small, A-frame shelters. These ruccos clustered together in open spaces, plazas, parks, and the high ground of the hills, forming vast, shantytown encampments. There was no electricity. There was no running water. There was no sewage system. The city of Valdivia had regressed to a pre-industrial state, but with the added burden of modern toxic debris. Inside the ruccos, life was defined by a pervasive, inescapable dampness. Everything was wet. Bedding, if it existed, was sodden. Smoke from small, open fires, lit inside the shelters for warmth, hung heavy in the stagnant air, stinging eyes and coating lungs. The smell of the camps was a mixture of wet wool, wood smoke, and the inevitable stench of broken sewer lines that had discharged their contents into the flooded streets. Survival became a communal act. The individual kitchen disappeared, replaced by the olja koman, the common pot. Neighbors who had previously lived largely separate lives pooled their dwindling resources. A sack of flour, a few potatoes, or a piece of salted meat were no longer private property, they were the fuel for the group. Women organized the cooking in shifts, stirring large cauldrons of soup over open fires in the rain, distributing sustenance to lines of gray, exhausted faces. This was not charity, it was a pragmatic necessity. Alone, a family might starve. Together, the neighborhood could endure. However, the physical hardship was compounded by a unique psychological torture. The earth refused to stop moving. The magnitude 9.5 main shock was not a singular event but the opening of a seismic gate. In the weeks that followed, thousands of aftershocks battered the region. Some were minor tremors, others were powerful earthquakes in their own right, measuring 7.0 or higher. For the survivors huddled in the rucos, sleep became impossible. The ground was in a state of constant, nausea-inducing motion. Survivors described a sensation similar to seasickness, a permanent vertigo that made it difficult to walk even when the earth was still. The sound of a truck passing or a sheet of metal banging in the wind would trigger panic, sending people rushing out of their shelters, terrified that another great rupture was beginning. This psychological strain frayed the social fabric. Rumors spread through the camps faster than the flu. There were whispers that the sea was boiling, that the volcanoes in the Andes were all erupting simultaneously, that the government had abandoned the South. To maintain order, the military imposed strict martial law. The streets, dark and flooded, were patrolled by soldiers with orders to prevent looting. The line between survival scavenging and criminal theft blurred. In the absence of a functioning police force, the atmosphere was tense. A curfew was enforced. After dark, the only light came from the flickering fires of the rucos and the beams of military flashlights cutting through the rain. In these conditions, time lost its structure. There were no work schedules, no school bells, no clocks that mattered. There was only the daylight, used for digging and scavenging, and the night, endured in the cold, waiting for the ground to shake again. While the survivors in Valdivia battled the mud and the cold, the coastal settlements to the west were facing an existential threat that arrived not from the earth, but from the sea. The mechanics of a subduction zone earthquake involve a violent vertical displacement of the seafloor. When the Nazca Plate slipped, it did not slide smoothly, it snapped upward, lifting millions of tons of seawater in a single, instant motion. This energy had to go somewhere. At the port town of Corral, situated at the mouth of the Valdivia River, the earthquake had already leveled the masonry buildings. The survivors, dazed and terrified, gathered on the hillsides and the upper streets, looking out toward the bay. Approximately 15 minutes after the shaking stopped, they witnessed a phenomenon that contradicted all devastating logic. The ocean began to leave. The water receded rapidly from the shore, sucking furiously past the breakwaters. It exposed the rocky seabed, stranding fish and revealing the skeletons of old shipwrecks. It was a silence of water, a vacuum creating a false sense of curiosity. Some, unaware of the hydrodynamics of a tsunami, walked down to the beach to investigate. Then, the ocean returned. It did not arrive as a cresting, surfing wave, but as a turbulent, rising wall of dark water, churning with the debris of the ocean floor. The first wave struck with the force of a battering ram, smashing into the ruins of the port. But it was the third wave, the largest in the sequence, that delivered the true devastation. Rising nearly 40 feet in height, it engulfed the coastline, tearing concrete foundations from the earth and carrying ships far inland. In the coastal village of Puerto Saavedra, the destruction was absolute. The town did not merely suffer damage, it was erased. The hydraulic force of the water scoured the land down to the bedrock. When the water finally receded, there were no streets, no walls, and no landmarks. The geography had been reset. The energy released by the Valdivia rupture was so immense that it could not be contained by the geography of Chile. The tsunami waves transformed the Pacific Ocean into a conduit for destruction. Traveling at the speed of a jet airliner, roughly 500 miles per hour, the waves raced westward across the open water. 15 hours later, the energy struck Hilo, Hawaii. Despite warning systems, the layout of Hilo Bay amplified the waves, killing 61 people and destroying the waterfront. 22 hours after the quake, the waves reached the coast of Japan, on the other side of the planet. In a tragic delay of information, many coastal residents in Japan were unaware of the scale of the Chilean event. The waves surged into the Sanrica coast, killing over 140 people and destroying homes that were thousands of miles from the epicenter. Back in southern Chile, the survivors on the high ground watched the sea recede for the final time. The landscape below them was unrecognizable. Ships sat in the middle of fields. Houses were floating in the bay. The bodies of those caught in the lowlands were being carried out to sea. The survivors were now trapped between a flooded interior and a hostile ocean. They were wet, freezing, and entirely isolated. The earth had betrayed them, and the sea had followed suit. In the hierarchy of survival, they had reached the bottom. They were alive, but they had lost the world they knew. 2 months after the initial rupture, the crisis of Lake Rhynehu did not end with a cheer, but with a slow, muddy exhale. The channel dug by the shovel heroes finally reached the necessary depth. The water began to flow. It was not a gentle release. The volume was still immense, and the lower neighborhoods of Valdivia were flooded yet again, but the catastrophic wall of water that had threatened to erase the city never materialized. The human effort had succeeded. The hydraulic pressure eased, and the lakes returned to their natural rhythm. As the floodwaters receded and the frequency of the aftershocks diminished, the survivors emerged to face a permanent reality. The city was not just broken, it was lower. The tectonic plates had not merely shaken the region, they had physically altered its elevation. The continental shelf had dropped. In Valdivia, the land had subsided by nearly 8 feet. Areas that had once been fertile pastures or industrial riverside districts were now permanently below the waterline. The map of southern Chile had to be redrawn. Streets that residents had walked on for generations were now canals. The ruins of factories stood half-submerged in the river, like ancient monuments rising from a swamp. The geography of the city had shifted from a solid urban grid to a wetland archipelago. With the immediate threat of extinction gone, the isolation broke. The international community arrived. It was one of the largest humanitarian airlifts in history. American field hospitals were erected in the mud, their canvas tents standing in stark contrast to the wooden debris of the city. Doctors from around the world treated gangrene, pneumonia, and exposure. Food supplies arrived from nations that, just 15 years prior, had been enemies in a world war. But for the people of Valdivia, there was no return to normal. The economy was shattered. The industrial base was gone. Thousands of families were homeless, living in a landscape that remained perpetually waterlogged. The survival phase had ended, but the endurance phase, the long, slow acceptance of a life built on unstable ground, was just beginning. They had survived the shaking, the tsunami, and the flood. Now, they had to survive the memory. Today, if you walk through the outskirts of Valdivia, you will see vast, beautiful wetlands where cattle once grazed. These marshes are not a natural geological feature, they are the flooded scars of 1960, a permanent memorial to the land that sank. The Great Chilean Earthquake did more than destroy a region, it reset our understanding of the planet. The data gathered from the event provided the final, irrefutable proof for the theory of plate tectonics. It taught science that the Earth rings like a bell for days after such a rupture, and that the ground we build upon is never truly stationary. But for the survivors, the legacy is not scientific. It is a quiet, inherited resilience. They endured a force equivalent to the total energy consumption of the United States for a year, released in mere minutes. They did not conquer nature. One cannot conquer a moving planet. They simply, stubbornly, refused to be erased by it. The earth eventually stopped moving. The water receded. But in the silence that followed, the people of southern Chile understood a truth that most of us forget: we exist only by the temporary consent of the ground beneath our feet.